And so you can't just apply, one solution, one point of intervention in the system. But what you have to do is you have to apply pressure in smart ways in different parts of the system so that little by little you reduce these reinforcing flows of money and corruption and violence, and you turn it into what you call virtuous cycles.
Hi everybody, thank you for being here tonight on this gorgeous spring evening. My name's Mary Eintema, and I'm the president of WorldBoston, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the Great Decisions program. We are delighted to be here tonight and that you're joining us, whether you are here at the Boston Public Library or virtually on Zoom. So we always start the same way, and that is to thank the Lowell Institute, which generously supports our Great Decisions series and makes it available to all of us for free. So we really thank them. We also thank our excellent production partners at GBH Forum Network, who are making it possible for our virtual audience to join us tonight. Now, finally, at last, the topic of tonight's program, very topical indeed, drug policy in Latin America. We've had a few in the United States. The first one was under Richard Nixon, who declared drugs public enemy number one, and then Reagan revived or continued it, and here we are today. So that really qualifies the war on drugs as the United States' longest running war, although we might not think of it as a war in the traditional sense. So what do these policies actually entail? How have they impacted the region? And after 50 years of these policies, where do we go from here? So very straightforward questions for our excellent speaker tonight, Dr. Evan Ellis, to handle. I'm going to abbreviate his biography. You can read it on our website. But he is a research professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, with a focus on the region's relationships with China and other non-Western Hemisphere actors, as well as transnational organized crime and populism. He has published over 350 works, including 5 books, including most recently, 2022, China Engages Latin America, Distorting Development and Democracy, ? He previously served on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff with responsibility for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as international narcotics and law enforcement. So in his academic capacity, Dr. Ellis has presented to forums in 27 countries and 4 continents, and has given testimony on Latin American security issues to Congress on various occasions. He was awarded, I practice this, I don't speak Spanish, so I'll try, the Order of Military Merit Jose Maria Cordova by the Colombian government for his scholarship on security issues in the region. So in other words, we're in very good hands with this complicated topic. Thank you very much, Dr. Ellis, for joining us, and I will turn it over to you. Thanks.
Good evening. First of all, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here with the group. I want to thank WorldBoston and Mary and the team for having this opportunity to share my work with you. As you indicated, let me see if I can move over. This is far too large of far too small of a group to be this far away. So you all can hear me if I talk from about right here? Okay, fantastic. Fantastic, okay. Let's see if we can actually get the clicker working. There we go. There's me. Okay. Fantastic. Okay, so as Maria indicated, I had spent a year on Secretary Mike Pompeo's policy planning staff, and among my other responsibilities was international narcotics and law enforcement. But I want to emphasize that while I will speak very frankly about a range of different things as I see those policies, these are my personal opinions and do not represent necessarily either the current or previous administrations. So first of all, this is a complicated topic, as was suggested. There are a number of different things that really defy the way we commonly think of these. I have far too many slides and far too many words to cover them in about the 25 minutes that we have tonight. I do want to leave time for question and answers. So let me just hit some of the high points. What I wanted to say by this slide, number one is you can see from some of the words here, the current focus on cocaine and now synthetic drugs and opioids, et cetera. This is not the first time that we have dealt with drugs and the fight against drugs. We had concerns about a century and a half ago about the arrival of opium. We had concerns early in the last century about cocaine. The first time around, as was pointed out, we had, even during the Nixon administration, we wrestled with this idea of drugs and the culture and the reaction to the culture of the 1960s as we moved into the 1970s. Even back then, some debates about the legalization of marijuana. But what you might remember well was that as we moved into the era of Ronald Reagan and its morning in America, that you really began to see some of the impacts of the cocaine culture. You remember, of course, famously the show Miami Vice with Don Johnson and cocaine in Miami Beach and things like that. But you also may remember Nancy Reagan, who is the first lady with the DARE program, this idea of we need to not only address interdiction, but we also need to address demand. We oftentimes talk about how we don't address demand, but oftentimes we have spent a lot of money in the country trying to address demand, but the question is the degree to which we do so has not always been that effective. Also, what I really want to emphasize is the way in which what was happening with respect to drug demand and drug use and drug patterns here in the United States as this problem has evolved has been closely tied to situations in Latin America. So if you go back to, for example, the 1980s and a little bit before, it was interesting that, at least when we talk about cocaine, most of the early cocaine was not produced in Colombia. It was actually produced in Peru. And so politically, Peru was fighting against a very bloody rural-based guerrilla movement, Sendero Luminoso, Shining Path. And as the Peruvian government began to establish control over the countryside, one of the things that happened is that the area that was a little bit safer to actually produce cocoa that was made into cocaine, Colombia began to look like a better bet than Peru did. And so what you actually saw happening was that during the 1980s, the rise of cocaine or cocoa production in Colombia was an artifact, in part, of what was happening in Peru. You also may remember in Colombia the rise of people like Pablo Escobar, the idea of the production of cocaine in Colombia, and then its movement through the Caribbean, through Central America. But it really took until the mid-'80s where we in the United States began realizing what a difficult problem this was. As a matter of fact, a key moment was the murder of a DEA agent, Kiki Camarena, and that really led to the mobilization of even more resources, more attention in Washington. I'm going to highlight kind of a couple key moments. This is a very complex thing, but I want to kind of give you the idea of how domestic actions, foreign policy all fit together. So, number one, an interesting thing that happened, of course, as we began to focus on this in the United States, especially during the era of Bill Clinton, was that we began to say, well, let's put people guilty of drug crimes in prison. And so there was a dramatic increase, as you may have seen, in the incarceration rate, with significant impacts for generations to come. Another thing that happened in Colombia is that as the Colombian government and as others focused on the problem, which was sowing enormous corruption in Colombia itself and violence in Colombia, they did finally take down Pablo Escobar. And there was a series of things. After taking down Pablo Escobar in the Medellin cartel, there was another cartel that dominated for a while based out of Cali, Colombia, and then there were a series of smaller cartels. But some of the key role that Colombia had played in really orchestrating those global drug flows, in which Mexican families were more the intermediaries, that began to change as we got to the mid-'90s and at the end of the '90s. Now, I want to emphasize one other important thing, which is most of what we'll talk about here with US drugs and the connection to Latin America has to do with drugs that were produced in Colombia, at least initially, and would come up through the Caribbean or Central America to the United States. But there are actually multiple different paths for drug flows. So you have, for example, many of the drugs which are still produced in Peru and Bolivia flow Peru, Bolivia down to the south of Argentina, into Brazil, and sometimes over Europe. Or some of what is produced in Peru and Bolivia also goes down into Chile. Chile actually consumes, on a per capita basis, a lot of drugs. Some actually goes over to Asia itself, to various parts of not only China, Japan, Singapore, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look in different parts of South America, for example, in Brazil, you have an increasingly powerful gang called the First Capital Command, which is getting increasingly powerful in places like Paraguay, in Peru, even Argentina. And so when we focus on what's happening, for example, in Mexico with the Sinaloa cartel or the Jalisco Nueva Generación cartel, we forget that there are a lot of different impacts with different gangs and smuggling groups all across the Americas as that drug production serves different markets from different places. But we tend to focus on what affects us. Having said that, a few other important things that were happening. Number one, in the mid-90s, realizing, again, going back to that Miami Vice motif, all the drugs coming into Key West and Miami, we said, we need to do something about this. So we established a joint interagency task force, which is roughly known as GIATO South, to bring interagency resources and resources of different partner nations in the region to try to shut down some of these things. It has to do with radars and patrol assets and other things. But the collective effects of GIATO South made it a lot harder to just send things by plane or just send things like by boat up through the Caribbean. And so that reinforced another effect, which is the increased use of land routes going through places like Guatemala, Honduras, etc. And as that began to happen, the amount of corruption and violence of groups in those land routes, as you can imagine, began to take off. Now, another thing was happening, a couple things were happening at the time as well. Number one, as we get into the 2000s, you saw in Colombia, the government of Álvaro Uribe, some real efforts by Colombia to push back against the large guerrilla groups, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, the FARC, and to a lesser extent, the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, the ELN. More success against those groups actually than against the drug groups. However, as Colombia got more and more control over its national territory, it did a better and better job at reducing cocoa under cultivation. It began to get the problem under control there, but it began to displace it to other places. Another thing that happened in Central America, so you begin to see the connections here, in the Northern Triangle, the previous decade in Central America, you had a lot of very bloody civil wars, especially in Guatemala, going from 1960 to 1996, a bloody civil war also, of course, in El Salvador. And at the end of those civil wars, they did something that made sense. They dramatically reduced the size of the military that were seen as part of the problem. And at the same time, they restructured, sometimes in a very unwise way, a lot of the police forces. And so as the drug problem was ramping up, as the gang problem was ramping up, you had relatively limited public security capability to deal with them. And so that made things in terms of the smuggling and the drug routes even worse. Another thing that was happening, of course, is in Mexico. Again, remember that as the Colombian groups became weakened and weakened, the Mexican groups that used to operate as the intermediaries, groups such as Sinaloa, groups such as the Beltran Leyva organization, groups such as the Arellano Felix organization, the Gulf Cartel on the Tamaulipas side, they became more and more important in their own right in moving these drugs. things began getting so bad with so much corruption and so much violence that when, in 2006, a new government came in, a more conservative government, Felipe Calderón, he said, hey, we've got to do something about this. They were, cutting the heads off of people and rolling them across the floor in nightclubs in Michoacan and things like that. And so that was the beginning of Felipe Calderón's drug war, so to speak. Unfortunately, what happened is that the Mexican government did a pretty good job at taking down some of the heads of the cartels, just like we did a pretty good job going after some of the bad guys in the war on terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan. But what happens is when you take out the leaders, the groups fragment. It becomes even more unpredictable, and you have more groups and smaller groups and more violence. And so things started getting more violent and more chaotic in Mexico. Another thing that was happening is that some of the violence was spreading in a southerly direction. So as Central America began to get a little bit more effective in controlling drug flows there, some of the narco-traffickers started moving things more through Panama and through Costa Rica, which also started to see increasing violence. So what was going on in the current time? A few things that are useful to think about in terms of our own response. As we looked at this expanding violence and these expanding challenges in the contemporary era, first of all, especially with what was going on in Mexico with the violence there, we said Mexico needs some help. And so you may remember Plan Merida, which was in part about the violence, in part about the drugs. The reality is the amount of money and the amount of actual programs that went into Mexico was a drop in the bucket. At the end of the day, it was actually the Mexican government themselves in terms of the amount of security forces. So for example, there was a debate about giving the Mexicans 4 helicopters. And at the end of the day, the Mexicans said, hey, we can buy the helicopters. The Mexicans ended up spending $1.4 billion on helicopters, on surveillance aircraft, on Humvees, far larger than any other military sales any place in Latin America because they bought them from us. But just the idea that Plan Merida was actually a relatively small effort. If it was small, the amount that we gave to those Northern Triangle countries that were also dealing with drug smuggling was even smaller. And under Carsi, it was a couple $100 million. And the money that we gave, frankly, for security under the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative to the Caribbean was probably even less. Now, again, going very quickly, with the Trump administration, we were continuing those programs. However, as you also recall, the Trump administration put much more of a focus on immigration than necessarily the drugs. Interdiction continued. However, because of some disputes over the negotiation of what were called asylum cooperation agreements, some of that security funding was actually cut off for about 2 years. I was actually on the policy planning staff at the time, and I can tell you it was frankly a real mess. But that had some negative impacts. Another thing that was complicating matters was that many states, frustrated with the level of violence, frustrated with the sense that these policies were not working, began to say, let's legalize some of the drugs which seem not quite as deadly. And so especially the movement to legalize marijuana in Uruguay and Jamaica and various other parts. And now, of course, as this was happening, you have other new things. You have the opioid epidemic, you have fentanyl now becoming increasingly available and creating some concerns. So that gets us, again, forgive the rapidity, to the current situations. So a couple things that I think are important to emphasize about where we are at now. So number one, the situation in Colombia. As you may be aware, in 2016, the Colombian government reached a peace agreement with the major guerrilla group, the FARC, that we talked about before. But one of the artifacts of that was that there was a temporary decrease in eradication, and there was actually some incentivizing to grow more. About at the same time, you had a takeoff. You also had the Colombian government finding that they could no longer do aerial spraying because of some of the health effects. And so you basically had a takeoff in cocoa production in Colombia. So on the one hand, in Colombia, you have literally a 5-time increase in the amount of cocoa. So a lot more drugs, a lot more drug money coming out of Colombia. At the same time, you also have other problems. Actually, next door, although I didn't mention it here, in Venezuela, you have an increasingly corrupted government. And so a lot of the drugs that were coming out of Colombia with the aid of Venezuela were being moved from Venezuela up into the Caribbean towards the United States. And actually, in Venezuela itself, Venezuela began to become a drug-growing area as well. Another thing that was happening, again, that fragmentation we talked about in Mexico, the situation was worsening, and in combination with the new government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who decided to reorganize the security sector and reprioritize some things, complicated the situation. In Central America, fragmentation. In Colombia, more fragmentation. We talked about Venezuela. A couple other problems, if this isn't already complicated enough. As you were aware, we had this thing that created dramatic economic and health effects in Latin America as well as here in the US, COVID-19. In addition to Latin America suffering a greater number of per capita fatalities than any other region of the world, something like 30% of all COVID-19 fatalities in the world were in Latin America. However, in addition to that, because of the shutdowns, you had a dramatic increase in the number of people that slipped out of the middle class into poverty, people that lost their jobs with small and medium enterprises and slipped into the informal sector. You had a disruption in drug patterns, and actually some of the narco-trafficking groups had the advantages of being able to consolidate control over neighborhoods when the police had to pull back a little bit and began to become the ones who were distributing food aid and reinforcing curfews in those neighborhoods. And so in many ways, COVID-19 was a boom for criminal organizations because they reorganized the patterns in ways the police are still trying to catch up with. People were poorer, and so more people in more need to allow drug groups to maybe use their bank accounts to do micro money laundering or other things like that. You had more people that were needing to participate in other criminal activities, etc. And of course, there are also innovations because of the shutdowns and borders in the supporting technologies. And so during the time, we began to see more use of private aircraft and yachts, as well as submersibles and semi-submersible craft going up, for example, through the Pacific to move drugs in ways that was not quite as apparent before. Okay, so again, a very brief sketch of some of the policies and some of the current challenges with the interdiction in the drug flows. Let me talk a little bit about where the current administration is at. So obviously, one of the big issues right now is the number of people that are dying, and it's getting worse with respect to drug overdoses. That's a number of different things, but the number one cause is arguably fentanyl. Fentanyl, again, is very deadly, and very small imperfections in the amount of dose can lead to overdoses. This is why you have, again, it's not being made by pharmaceutical laboratories. It's being made by, amateurs in their own, in their own laboratories. And so you had last year 106,000 drug overdoses. Fentanyl directly, fentanyl laced into opioids, fentanyl laced into cocaine, fentanyl laced into other things. On top of that, again, the suffering of COVID-19 arguably made the situation worse. But when you say, well, what is the Biden administration doing? A lot of times when we have this conversation, there's the sense of, we're too focused on interdiction, we're not focusing on demand reduction. I'm going to say something that's a little bit controversial, but I saw this. You can actually see it in the numbers, and you can see it in the programs. We actually spent a lot of money on demand reduction and effects here in the US. We do a lot on interdiction as well. But for example, if you look at the current Biden administration program, you actually see that 6 of the 7 pillars of that program are focused on demand reduction or demand effects. Everything from treatment of addiction to assessing differences in different groups who become addicts and who become involved in the criminal part. Everything from trying to reduce the harm that occurs to people when they take drugs and do overdoses, for example, making naxocoline more available, things like more programs to prevent drug use, trying to prevent addicts from falling back into addiction by giving them options for having a sustainable job after they stop being addicts, and again, recovery support services. Only one of those pillars is focused on supply reduction. Now, having said that, you also do see that again, $44 billion of programs in National Drug Program budget. And so again, what I would point out is that you actually do see a lot of money going into reduction and effects here across a number of different areas. So again, looking at communities, looking at preventing overdoses, again, virtually all of the major relevant organizations in the US government have a piece of this in one way or another. So why does this message not come out? Number one is it is a little bit of a policy change, but frankly, even under the previous administration, there was still a lot of money that was spent on demand reduction. Number two, frankly, at the end of the day, interdiction is sexier and it's more visible than these type of things. The amount of money that's spent, it's really expensive to get somebody who has become addicted, to treat them and to get them off. It's really expensive to persuade youth not to become hooked in these highly addictive things. So it's actually very expensive to do this, although a lot of money. And at the end of the day, I would say that there is no one right solution, that you either do all demand reduction or all, but there's a question in our policy of what is the right balance. So let me go at this point then to the question of, well, what are some of the policies that are being talked about and what are some of the appropriate policy responses? Now, I'm going to be a little bit controversial here and anticipate some of the talk that, okay, well, why don't we legalize drugs? Well, why don't we legalize marijuana, et cetera? Well, one of the things, these are some, and I will put these out there as questions rather than answers, and we can talk about this in the Q&A. So number one, there's a question of if you legalize things, and these are experiments that you see in various parts of Europe, the impact on increased rates of addiction, especially if you legalize highly addictive substances, even with associated health support, you get more addiction and you get higher levels of criminality. There are certain drugs you can say, well, maybe they're not as addictive, maybe they're not as lethal, such as marijuana. Again, you have at least legitimate debates of the role of drugs like marijuana as gateway drugs or not, even if they're not as lethal. Number two, there's the question of, is there an adequate social safety net realistically in the country? So maybe in the United States, you can legalize certain things and we have a good enough health system. But in Latin America, because remember, in places like the southeast of Brazil, with a consumption of their version of crack cocaine that they call bazuco, or in Argentina, they call it paco. Chile, for example, also is the highest per capita consumer of cocaine in the region, in part because of their relatively high per capita GDP. But so it's not just in the United States that people consume various different types of drugs. And so if you begin to legalize in countries that do not have the same type of health and safety net that we do in the United States, who suffers the most in those systems? Again, remember, just in COVID, 30% of all COVID deaths occurred, global COVID deaths occurred in Latin America globally. And so you really have to wonder about, is the health network adequate if we go to this type of approach? Another question is, does this solve the problem? So one of the issues, what you see, the legalization of marijuana and other things, is the infrastructure of different organizations. They're not just involved in trafficking cocaine. Oftentimes they're involved in multiple different activities. And so if you make, for example, marijuana legal, or if you make cocaine legal, you've now taken one pillar of what may be 5 or 6 different pillars. And so what you see sometimes is that organizations that are disposed to do illegal things, on the one hand, that orientation towards illegal activity, what it leads them is to essentially stay in the now legal market, but that now gives them a legal way to launder their money from other areas more effectively. At the same time, they can extort or muscle other people who are trying to do it legitimately out of that space to preserve that space for themselves. And the other thing that you see in places like Uruguay is that even with the elimination even if you legalize something like marijuana, for example, Uruguay a couple of years ago began legalizing marijuana. You still have a black market in marijuana in Uruguay. Well, why is that? Well, because Uruguay said, we're going to do marijuana safely. So you're going to have registered marijuana growers in certain places, and they're going to have certain tests and sanitary conditions, and you're going to sell it only to registered boutiques. And that's good, but it's expensive. And so what happens is you still get essentially discount marijuana made without all of those expensive controls on the cheap, mostly in the east of Paraguay, in places like Concepcion. And so it still undercuts the legal marijuana. So at the end of the day, if it's marijuana or whether it's cocaine or something else, it may not actually eliminate the illicit market and everything that's associated with it. But again, what it does is it makes it difficult to say that if a criminal organization has this money, it gives them more opportunities to launder that money through what now are legal paths. The other thing, and I can tell you again, having dealt with this when I was at INL, or at least overseeing INL, is this creates a legislative nightmare. And this is something that you all are familiar with. So, for example, if in one state marijuana is legal for medicinal purposes, in another state it's legal for everything, in another state it's legal for just certain conditions, how do you control that if you're law enforcement in a global, you can, but the amount that you have to work on to prove that becomes really difficult. One of the other things is the question of if you legalize, who benefits the most and who harms the most? And again, as somebody who spent my entire career as somebody focused on Latin America, in many ways, if we say, well, we're selfish in focusing on not doing more about demand, legalization, we can say we're selfish as well. I would put out there that the net effects of legalizing end up hurting Latin America more in terms of their health system and their violence and basically who the returns to those flows go to. And actually the net benefits in terms of the reduction of violence and criminalization and things like that, we end up benefiting more from legalization, and Latin America ends up getting harmed more from legalization. Anyway, I hope I've said at least a few relatively stimulating things. We've left a good amount of time, and so I welcome the questions and answers. And so thank you for being here, and I look forward to your feedback and a good discussion.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I'm wearing a mic and start off with a question. So in the briefing book, which I really recommend to all of you, there's a very interesting statement that by the 21st century, the legacy of decades of militarization and military responses to the drug problem has altered civil-military balances, right, in the region, as well as the quality of Latin America's fragile democracies. So I guess, we've got the State Department in democracy versus authoritarianism coming up, but what role do varying governmental systems in the region play in the war on drugs?
Sure, no, that's a great question. And I would say that it's...
And how do you feel about that militarization assessment?
No, it's a great question. So first of all, for me, a lot of times we use terms that have certain value connotations that are maybe a little bit inaccurate. So the question, what do we mean by militarization? And if by militarization we mean a greater role for the armed forces in law enforcement or the pushback against drugs, where is that happening and why? And so, number one, the idea of interdiction. And so Latin America as a transit zone, who is best poised to do interdiction? And typically, by design. Not many police forces have radars. Not many police forces have capabilities to, intercept aircraft or intercept boats. I mean, there are some, but anytime you start talking about certain types of interdiction, you get into needing certain type of assets that are traditionally in the hands of militaries. A second thing that's happened, of course, is that Latin American police forces, especially with the amount of corruption, the amount of violence, have found themselves overwhelmed. And so it hasn't been so much the drug is the question of really two things: manpower and firepower. So manpower in the sense that, okay, if you need to do tighter control of borders, the famous blind crossings, the pasos ciegos, what do you do? If you might have border control forces, but oftentimes the military has been used to do some of that border control. But also, as the groups have money to protect the cocaine labs and to protect their other operations, and you begin introducing firepower, much of which, but not all of which, of course, is acquired in the United States. That means, okay, well, police forces traditionally don't have that level of firepower, and so, if you're going to take down that group, or even oftentimes in countries like El Salvador, you don't have arrest authority by the military, but what you do have is a need for the military to essentially escort and provide protection to the police. And so the question of militarization, I would say, first of all, is a bit of a misnomer. Now, you do have situations, so for example, Honduras, the concept was that the police, because of contact with the criminal elements, had become so corrupted. There was a sense in Honduras that you needed you needed units trained in policing within the military. Now the question is, the Honduran Constitution says that you can do it. So it's not illegal or unconstitutional. So the military police for public order, the PMOP. So if it's legal, if it's constitutional, if you receive the right amount of training. It was interesting, I actually dealt with the PMOP, and the PMOP arguably had better...
What is the PMOP?
So under the previous government of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, they created this new elite, essentially militarized police force.
Okay, got it.
And it was, police militar de orden público, so basically the military police for public order. But the idea was they couldn't rely on the civil police, and so you would create this unit within the military. And it actually had some effectiveness. But the issue was, you had the legal framework, you had the training. Matter of fact, they probably had better training in certain tactics than... And so the question is it bad just because it's military or not police? Now, obviously, there's kind of a broader sense. So you get into these type... At the end of the day, my feeling is that the involvement of the military, there's a symptom of the degree to which the power of the groups and their firepower has gotten out of hand. So it's a symptom of the problem, and not just, well, you shouldn't do it with the military. Number two, there's a question of the military may be a temporary solution, but it can't be a long-term solution. If you use it as a stopgap, you need to move towards the right authorities and capabilities and training in the police. Okay. And the third thing, and the final thing is, for me, the key question is, if you use the military, it's, do they have the appropriate authorities? Do they have the appropriate training? Do they have the appropriate protections? And if you check those boxes, you say, okay, it may not be as bad as you think. But again, this is an area where serious people disagree. But I'll stop at that point to leave time for at least one more question.
So I see Ed has a question, and Mary, you can fight it out between you two. And also, I'm going to apologize. So rude. I'm using my phone. That's how I'm staying in touch with what's happening on Zoom. I would not be using my phone with a speaker otherwise. All right, go ahead, Ed.
All the money we've spent on and the havoc we've wreaked in Central America and South America, what effect does any of that have on the flow of drugs into this country? None. That's the answer.
So there's a question.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Why are we bothering with this? I understand there's a lot of money poured into it, and there's people get that money.
All right. And since you're strategically located next to each other,
sure,
as they are in life, do you want to ask your question, Mary?
When did we finally come as a government to the realization that it would be a good idea to address the demand for drugs by treating it, and to sit there and sort of take away some of that market for drugs that has been here for apparently quite a long time?
Okay.
Sure.
2 questions for you.
No, and you raise very good questions. And I think the first thing that you point out is that the ability to deal with these, whatever we do, is very limited. And I would say that both reducing demand and reducing supply are very difficult problems. And so, you have the question of, do we just give up? Or do we try to do something, and do we try to do better? And so my personal sense is that we have to treat this as an interdependent system. And it's interesting, part of my previous training, methodological training, is something that's actually was pioneered not too far from here at MIT at the Sloan School, called system dynamics, understanding how you look at its systems in positive and negative feedback loop. And so you can't just apply one solution, one point of intervention in the system, but what you have to do is you have to apply pressure in smart ways in different parts of the system, so that little by little you reduce these reinforcing flows of money and corruption and violence, and you turn it into what you call virtuous cycles. And so it's not easy, because what it has to do is what is the right balance as it shifts between intervention and going after the groups, but also anticipating the secondary effects as you go after the groups, to mitigate the violence, going after the money, which I think is one of the key points, reducing demand, but not focusing everything just on demand reduction. And so I would submit that absolutely we have not always done the intervention policies in the most effective way, probably a very ineffective way. But for me, I would flip the question around the other way, which is, if not this, then what? And that's a.
Okay.
And ma'am, I don't think I answered your question.
Yeah, when did we decide or come to the realization as a policy from a home perspective
Okay.
that it would be good to address demand?
All right, do you want to repeat that so that Zoom
Sure.
picks it up?
Absolutely. No, it's a very good
okay.
question of when did we realize at the policy level to address demand. And that was why I mentioned Nancy Reagan and DARE, and as maybe ineffective as that was. From the very beginning, we at least had this concept that we needed to reduce demand. The question is, how effective? Because it's not just a matter of just say no. It's a matter of, how do you create alternative economic opportunities? How do you create public relation campaigns? How do you treat addiction so that people who become addicted can get back? There's a whole series of things that have to be brought together in the right balance. I would say that we've been getting more sophisticated, and probably the holistic emphasis of this administration is a little bit different than the previous administration. However, I think we're still getting it right, and it's not at all clear that the right amounts of money are going into the right places for those programs. But I think we know the concept, but how you actually, it's one thing to say, okay, we need to fix this. It's another thing to say, well, what are the specific things that you need to do? Growing a garden is about more than just putting seeds down and putting water. And I think we're kind of at that point right now.
Okay, we're going to try and pick up a couple of more questions, so we're going to motor through them. We'll go to Ruel first, and then this gentleman in the front, and then we'll see how we're doing on Zoom, and we're going to bounce through them, and of course we have some discussion upstairs too. So Ruel, go ahead.
Thank you for your talk.
Thank you, sir.
It seems to me that the level of drug use is always related to the economic situations in countries, ours and others. And so in Latin America has been economically depressed and treated as a colony for almost the entire time of Western involvement. I would ask you, would it make some sense to bring China into this instead of as an enemy violating the Monroe Doctrine, but as an ally in trying to pump money in and creating economic activity?
Okay.
If you create economic activity, you can reduce the amount of drug demand.
Right, thank you. And why don't we pick up this question, and you can train them up.
Hi, thank you for the for the talk. I'm Lucas, Northeastern University, and my question is regarding the role of law enforcement in the U.S. There's a lot of talk about corrupt military and police officers in Latin America and all its diversity. Well, the U.S. is almost like 50 different countries, each with different levels of law enforcement and police activity and different standards. How do you see that those different levels working regarding policy, and how much of the demand restriction that should be from, how much of, I wouldn't say or corruption or incompetence or oversight by those different levels of law enforcement is, how much in the system is there that can be reduced internally, that can be worked internally rather than focusing on the outside?
Great.
Thank you very much.
Both very good questions. So let me start with the first one. And for me, the bottom line is these things are all complicated. It's not just one thing or another. And so, for me, it's the question of, it's like, do we have, highways without guardrails? It's like, to me, the economy is clearly one factor that, people without opportunities who, for one reason or another, fall into depression or lack of other alternatives, et cetera, that is certainly a strong contributing factor both in getting in and getting out. But then you also have this notion of the addictiveness and lethality of some substances. I mean, that's what, in terms of fentanyl, in terms of the opioids, in terms of cocaine, that really worries me because, the net effect, if you're taken down one route for whatever combination of social economic reasons. And so to me, there is a important, but government shouldn't be just about criminalizing and things like that, but to me, there has to be a balance between addressing the socioeconomic effects, but also signaling and making it highly undesirable to go down that route. With respect to China, it's interesting because when I worked with INL, we actually worked closely with the Chinese on things like fentanyl. The Chinese actually did do some things, although they were always a little bit hesitant to let us see too much under the tent in terms of their own dirty laundry. But of course, they did certain things to make it harder to stop sending fentanyl by mail directly to the United States. And so now a lot of the fentanyl goes into Mexico and it gets processed and assembled in Mexico, and then it comes into the United States. Or they did certain things to put certain synthetics on controlled substances lists that weren't there before, but then they changed the chemical formula and now it comes in different ways. But in terms of the role of China, and I deal directly with the impact of China in Latin America. And what I would argue is that the recipe China equals economic development is a bit of a misnomer, because if you introduce distortions, the question is who benefits from the projects. Do Chinese projects lead to more corruption? Do they lead to benefit actually for local employment? Or do they lead to opportunities for the Chinese companies and the local elites? And the reason I say that is that I think there are certain good things that for taking advantage of opportunities from China. For example, a country like Peru reaps significant amounts by selling its copper and its iron and other things to the PRC, and that is important. So I think Latin American states need to combine working with China while at the same time doing so through strong institutions to create the type of sustainable economic opportunities that do not make the problems such as drug addiction worse, but can actually move it in the right direction. Now, with respect to your question about local law enforcement, and I'm certainly not an expert on US law enforcement, it is a misnomer to say that just Latin American law enforcement is corrupt or has problems. I would say that the levels of corruption, just because of a legacy of institutions and the amount of illicit money, have tended to be somewhat higher in the Latin American countries where those drug flows have been greatest. But I mean, you still find corruption in our system. There also are the question of the ability to slow down corruption with things like confidence testing and lifestyle polygraphs and things like that oftentimes we have the resources more. And there's also, again, going back to that system dynamics analogy, if the system is a little bit corrupt, so if you're a dirty cop, so to speak, and you think that you are, that only 2% of the cops are dirty, then your likelihood of getting caught is pretty high. And so maybe you're going to be very careful about doing engaging in that action. But if you're in a system where you think that 50% of the cops are dirty and the judges are dirty and, you know, up to the president you're protected, then, you know, well, you're stupid if you don't engage in that. And so the problem is that it's not the absence or presence of corruption, but if you get down below a certain level, corruption becomes manageable. When it gets above a certain level, things start rapidly spiraling out of control. And so I think one of the differences is we are not yet there in the United States, but as we've seen with other things, there's the danger that we could get there if we don't take care of where things are going. But great question.
Okay, I am afraid that this part of our discussion has ended. We'll go up and have some more talking upstairs. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. Thanks to the amazing WorldBoston staff. And most of all, thank you very much to Dr. Evan Ellis. So thank you.
Thank you.